In the year 2018, in the small town of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Lillian Walker sat in her worn armchair by the window of her home on the outskirts of town, where ancient cypress trees cast long, jagged shadows across the faded wooden porch. The house, a modest single-story structure with peeling white paint, stood at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by the hum of cicadas and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the humid breeze. Lillian could not see the golden light streaming through the window pane, nor could she trace the outlines of the cypresses that loomed like silent sentinels outside. She had lost her sight a decade earlier in a chemical plant accident, a cruel twist of fate that left her world shrouded in darkness. Yet her other senses had sharpened to an almost supernatural degree, as if to compensate for the loss. The faintest creak of the floorboards, the subtle shift in the air before a storm, the texture of a surface under her fingertips. All these painted a vivid map of her surroundings, a world she navigated with precision and instinct. Every evening at precisely 7 o'clock, her husband, Edward Walker, returned home from his auto repair shop. His footsteps were a familiar rhythm in Lillian's silent universe, heavy, deliberate, accompanied by the faint squeak of his work boots against the hardwood floor. The sound was as reliable as a metronome, grounding her in the predictability of their life together. That evening, as the clock ticked toward 7, Lillian sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her head tilted slightly to catch the first hint of his arrival. The front door opened with its usual groan, and the metallic clatter of Edward's keys hitting the small wooden table by the entrance echoed through the house. She felt the air shift as he moved closer, his presence a warm disturbance in the stillness. He leaned down, as he often did, to brush a kiss against her forehead, a gesture that had once carried affection but now felt mechanical, perfunctory. As his lips grazed her skin, a new scent invaded her senses, sharp and unmistakable. It was not Edward's familiar cologne, with its woody notes of cedar and leather, a smell that had clung to him since their early days of courtship. This was something else, sweet, floral, with a warm undercurrent of vanilla that lingered like a whisper of indulgence. It was a woman's perfume, foreign and intrusive, clinging to Edward's jacket as though it had been pressed against another's skin. Lillian's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the armrests of her chair, the worn fabric rough under her palms. The scent was faint but undeniable, a trace of someone else's presence that had no place in their home. Edward, oblivious to the storm brewing in his wife's mind, moved past her, his boots thudding softly as he crossed into the living room. The click of the television remote followed, and the low drone of a sports channel filled the air, a sound as routine as his footsteps. Lillian remained in her chair, her body still but her mind racing. The perfume lingered in her nostrils, a ghost of betrayal that refused to dissipate. She tilted her head, inhaling deeply, trying to dissect the scent. It was not just the fragrance itself, but what it represented, a crack in the foundation of Edward's predictable routine. He was a man of habits, as steady as the Mississippi River that flowed through their town. Every morning he left for his auto shop at 6:30, his lunch packed in the same battered metal tin he'd used for years. Every evening he returned at 7, ate dinner in silence, and poured himself a glass of bourbon from the bottle he kept on the kitchen's top shelf, the amber liquid glinting in the dim light as he sipped it in his recliner. This routine had defined their marriage for 15 years, a rhythm Lillian had come to rely on in her sightless world. But the perfume was a disruption, a note out of tune, a signal that something or someone had entered their carefully ordered life. She sat motionless, her hands still gripping the armrests, her ears attuned to Edward's movements. He shifted in his recliner, the leather creaking under his weight, and she heard the faint clink of ice in his glass as he took a sip of his drink. The television blared on, but Lillian's focus was elsewhere, her senses sifting through the layers of the evening. The perfume was not a one-time anomaly, she decided. It was too distinct, too deliberate. She imagined Edward's jacket brushing against another woman, the fabric absorbing her scent during a moment of closeness that Lillian could not witness but could now feel as sharply as a blade. Her heart pounded, not with anger, but with a cold, analytical resolve. She could not see the truth, but she could smell it, touch it, hear it. Her fingers relaxed, releasing the armrests, and she leaned back in her chair, her face impassive. Edward continued watching his game, unaware of the shift in the room's atmosphere. Lillian's mind churned, piecing together the implications of the scent. She thought of their marriage, how it had weathered the storm of her accident, how Edward had stayed by her side through the surgeries and the long months of adjustment. He had been her anchor, her eyes in a world gone dark. But now this foreign fragrance suggested a different Edward, one who slipped away from her in ways she could not track with her eyes but could uncover with her other senses. She resolved to pay closer attention, to listen for irregularities in his steps, to feel for traces of this other woman on his clothes, to catalog every detail that could confirm her suspicions. The perfume was the first clue, a thread she would pull until the truth unraveled. Lillian remained in her chair as the evening wore on, the cicadas outside growing louder, their song blending with the hum of the television. Edward eventually rose, his boots scuffing the floor as he headed to the kitchen. She heard the familiar clink of the bourbon bottle being lifted from the shelf, the soft gurgle of liquid pouring into his glass. The scent of the liquor wafted toward her, momentarily masking the lingering trace of vanilla and flowers. But it was still there, faint but persistent, a reminder of the betrayal she now suspected. She did not move, did not call out to him. Instead, she let the silence between them grow, her thoughts sharpening like a blade honed in the dark. Lillian Walker, blind but not helpless, had begun to build a case against her husband, one that would rely on the senses he could not deceive. The morning after Lillian Walker caught the scent of another woman's perfume on her husband Edward, she resolved to uncover the truth hidden in her sightless world. As the first rays of Louisiana sunlight warmed the cypress-shaded porch of their Baton Rouge home, Lillian waited in her armchair, her ears attuned to the familiar sounds of Edward's departure. The clock struck 6:30, and the front door groaned as it opened, followed by the heavy thud of Edward's boots on the porch and the distant rumble of his pickup truck pulling away from the curb. Only when the sound of the engine faded into the morning hum of cicadas did Lillian rise, her movements slow but deliberate, guided by the mental map of her home she had perfected over a decade of blindness. She navigated the narrow hallway to the bedroom, her fingers trailing along the wall to count the door frames, her bare feet registering the transition from hardwood to the worn rug that marked the bedroom's entrance. The air in the room carried the faint musk of Edward's cologne, but Lillian's focus was singular. She moved toward the chair in the corner, where Edward often tossed his clothes after work. Her hands brushed over the familiar textures of the room, the smooth wood of the dresser, the soft edge of the bed, until they landed on the crumpled fabric of his yesterday's shirt, carelessly draped over the chair's back. She lifted it, the cotton heavy with the weight of the previous day, and brought it to her face. The scent hit her immediately, that same sweet floral perfume with its cloying hint of vanilla, now mingled with the acrid tang of Edward's sweat and the metallic undertone of motor oil from his auto shop. The perfume was fainter than the night before, diluted by time, but it was unmistakable, a lingering ghost of another woman's presence. Lillian's fingers explored the shirt further, tracing the seams and buttons with the precision of someone who saw with her hands. As she ran her fingertips along the collar, she paused. There, on the starched edge, was a faint stickiness, a residue that clung to her skin like a secret. She pressed harder, rubbing the spot between her thumb and forefinger. It was slick, waxy, the unmistakable texture of lipstick. Her heart quickened, but her face remained impassive, betraying none of the turmoil within. The lipstick was not hers. She had stopped wearing makeup years ago, after the accident, when the world of mirrors and appearances became irrelevant. This was another clue, a tactile confirmation of the betrayal she had begun to suspect. She folded the shirt carefully, placing it back on the chair exactly as she had found it, ensuring Edward would notice nothing amiss. With the shirt's secrets cataloged in her mind, Lillian moved to the living room, her steps measured but purposeful. She knelt before the small oak table where she kept her personal belongings, her fingers finding the familiar shape of an old wooden jewelry box, its surface worn smooth by years of touch. She opened it, the hinges creaking softly, and reached inside, her hands brushing past trinkets and keepsakes until they closed around a small notebook. This was no ordinary journal. It was designed for the blind, its pages filled with raised dots and a tactile code Lillian had mastered after losing her sight. She retrieved a stylus from the box and sat at the table, her fingers moving swiftly to punch a series of dots into the paper. The words took shape in her private language: shirt, perfume, lipstick. Each dot was a deliberate act, a commitment to the chain of evidence she was beginning to forge. She closed the notebook and returned it to the box, securing the lid with a soft click, her mind already racing toward the next step. As evening approached, Lillian resumed her vigil in the armchair by the window, the warmth of the setting sun replaced by the cool breath of dusk. The cicadas grew louder, their song a constant hum that blended with the distant sounds of Baton Rouge. Car horns, the occasional bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the cypress trees. She waited, her senses sharpened for Edward's return. The clock ticked past 7, and her unease grew with each passing minute. Edward was late, an irregularity that gnawed at her. Finally, at 7:45, the front door opened, and the familiar thud of his boots echoed through the house, slower and heavier than usual, as if weighed down by something more than the day's work. The keys clattered onto the table, and Lillian tilted her head, inhaling deeply. The perfume was there again, fainter now as though Edward had tried to mask it, but still clinging to his clothes like a stubborn shadow. It mingled with the sharper scent of bourbon, a premature hint of his nightly ritual. Edward moved past her without his usual kiss, his steps leading straight to the kitchen. Lillian listened as the refrigerator door opened with a soft hiss, followed by the clink of glass against the counter. She knew the routine by heart. Edward would reach for the bottle of Jack Daniels on the top shelf, pour 2 fingers into his heavy glass, and carry it to his recliner in the living room. The faint gurgle of liquid confirmed her mental image, followed by the sound of ice settling as he took his first sip. Lillian's lips curved into a faint smile, imperceptible in the dimness of her world. The perfume, though weaker, was still there, a thread connecting this evening to the last. She sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her ears cataloging every sound. His sigh as he settled into the recliner, the creak of the leather, the muted drone of the television flicking on. The evidence was mounting, each sensory clue a brick in the wall of suspicion Lillian was building. The perfume, the lipstick, the lateness. They were not accidents, but signs of a life Edward was living beyond her reach. She thought of their early years, when his laughter had filled the house, when he would describe the sunset to her in vivid detail, painting pictures with words to replace the colors she could no longer see. Those days were gone, replaced by a distance she had attributed to her blindness, to the strain of her dependence. But now she wondered if it was something else, someone else drawing him away. The smile faded from her lips, replaced by a cold determination. She would continue to gather her proof, to weave the threads of betrayal into a net that Edward could not escape. In the darkness of her world, Lillian Walker was no longer just a wife. She was a hunter, guided by senses sharper than sight. A week had passed since Lillian Walker began her silent investigation into her husband Edward's betrayal, and her senses, honed by years of blindness, had grown even sharper in their pursuit of truth. The small Baton Rouge home, nestled under the sprawling cypress trees, had become a battlefield of subtle clues, each one a whisper of infidelity that Lillian cataloged with meticulous care. Edward's behavior had shifted, his once predictable routine now punctuated by irregularities that pricked at Lillian's awareness like thorns. He lingered at his auto repair shop well past his usual 7 o'clock return, offering vague excuses about an influx of customer orders or overdue paperwork. Yet Lillian detected a tremor in his voice when he spoke of these supposed obligations, a faint quiver that betrayed unease, as if the words were rehearsed but not fully believed. His explanations were too quick, too eager to pivot to safer topics, like the weather or the creaking porch that needed repair, and Lillian, attuned to every nuance, sensed the deception beneath his casual tone. In the quiet hours of the night, when the house settled into a stillness broken only by the distant hum of cicadas, Lillian's attention turned to Edward's phone, a device he always left on the bedside table before sleep. She had noticed its presence more keenly since her suspicions took root, its weight and shape a new fixture in her mental map of the bedroom. One night, as the clock ticked past midnight, a faint vibration shattered the silence. A notification, soft but unmistakable, like the buzz of an insect trapped in a jar. Edward's steady breathing beside her indicated he was asleep, oblivious to the sound he had likely forgotten to mute. Lillian moved with the precision of someone who navigated darkness as naturally as others walked in light. She slid from the bed, her bare feet silent on the rug, and reached for the table, her fingers brushing the cool metal edge until they closed around the phone's smooth surface. The device was warm to the touch, a sign it had been used recently, perhaps just before Edward drifted off. She traced the screen, her fingertips searching for the familiar ridges of buttons or the slit glass. But the lock screen was a barrier she could not breach without sight. Frustrated, she held the phone for a moment longer, feeling its weight, its warmth, as if it might yield its secrets through touch alone. She returned it to the table, careful to place it exactly as she had found it, and slipped back into bed, her mind too restless for sleep. The memory of happier times haunted her as she lay awake, the darkness of her world filled with echoes of their early marriage. She recalled Edward's gentle voice describing the vibrant azaleas in their garden, his laughter as he brought her wildflowers picked from the roadside, their petals soft against her fingers. Those moments had faded, replaced by a growing distance, his touches now rare, and his words hollow, as if spoken from obligation rather than affection. The phone's vibration lingered in her thoughts, a new piece of evidence that fueled her determination. She resolved to expand her search beyond the house, to seek out traces of the other woman in places Edward might not expect her to explore. The next morning, after Edward's truck rumbled away, Lillian ventured into the yard, guided by the crunch of gravel under her shoes and the faint scent of damp earth carried by the morning breeze. The air was thick with the humidity of Louisiana, and she felt the sun's warmth on her face as she approached Edward's pickup, parked haphazardly near the porch. The driver's side door was unlocked, a carelessness that surprised her given Edward's recent caution. She opened it, the hinges creaking softly, and leaned inside, her hands sweeping over the cracked leather seat. The interior smelled of motor oil and the faint trace of that floral perfume, now a familiar intruder in her world. Her fingers explored the seatbelt, tracing its nylon strap until they snagged on something delicate, a long, smooth hair, too sleek and fine to be her own. She plucked it free, rolling it between her fingers, its texture distinct from her tightly coiled curls. This was no accident, no stray remnant from a customer at the shop. She slipped the hair into the pocket of her cardigan, her heart steady but her resolve hardening. Returning to the house, Lillian retrieved her tactile notebook from the jewelry box in the living room, her fingers moving swiftly to record the new finding. The stylus pressed into the paper, forming raised dots that spelled out, "Hair and truck, not mine." Each mark was a step closer to the truth, a link in the chain of evidence she was forging. She closed the notebook and replaced it in the box, her movements precise despite the storm of emotions within. Edward's growing caution had not escaped her notice. He now hung his clothes in the closet immediately upon returning home, and the sound of the shower running as soon as he entered the house had become a new ritual, as if he sought to wash away the traces of his secret life. But his nightly bourbon remained a constant, the clink of the bottle against the glass, a sound as reliable as his footsteps once were. Lillian began to see this habit as a vulnerability, a predictable thread in the fabric of his routine that she could exploit. As evening fell, Edward returned even later, the clock nearing 8:30 when his boots finally crossed the threshold. Lillian sat in her armchair, her senses alert to every detail. The perfume was there again, fainter now, as if he had taken greater care to mask it, but still detectable beneath the sharp bite of his cologne. She heard him move to the kitchen, the refrigerator door opening, the familiar gurgle of bourbon pouring into his glass. The scent of the liquor drifted toward her, but it could not erase the floral ghost that clung to him. Lillian's suspicions grew, spreading like the shadows of the cypress trees outside, their branches swaying in the evening breeze. She knew Edward was betraying her, but she needed undeniable proof, something beyond the fleeting traces of perfume and hair. In the silence of her darkened world, she began to envision his bourbon ritual not just as a habit, but as a key, a means to unlock the truth or perhaps to seal his fate. Lillian Walker's resolve solidified in the quiet of her Baton Rouge home, where the cypress trees outside swayed in the humid Louisiana breeze, their shadows stretching long and thin across the porch. Her suspicions about Edward's infidelity had grown into a certainty, fueled by the perfume, the lipstick, the hair, and the late-night phone vibrations that haunted her sleepless nights. She knew she could no longer live in the shadow of his betrayal, and her mind, sharp and unyielding despite her blindness, turned toward action. Edward's nightly ritual of pouring bourbon from his cherished bottle of Jack Daniels had become the focal point of her plan, a predictable rhythm in his otherwise guarded behavior. The bottle, kept on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, was a constant in their home, untouched by anyone but him, its presence as reliable as the cicadas' hum outside. Lillian began to familiarize herself with the kitchen in a way she never had before, her hands mapping the space with a precision born of necessity. She moved through the room, her fingers brushing over the cool tiles of the countertop, the smooth edges of the refrigerator, the wooden cabinet doors with their slightly warped hinges. She reached up to the top shelf, her arms stretching to find the familiar shape of the bourbon bottle. Her fingertips grazed the glass, cool and slightly sticky with a thin layer of dust that had settled over months of neglect by everyone except Edward. The dust was a tactile confirmation of the bottle's exclusivity to him. No one else in the house touched it, not even to clean it. She lifted it carefully, feeling its weight, the faint slosh of liquid inside, and traced the embossed lettering of Jack Daniels with her thumb. The bottle's surface told a story of solitude, its dust a testament to Edward's private ritual, performed each night as he poured exactly 2 fingers into his heavy glass. The clink of it against the kitchen table, a sound as familiar to Lillian as her own heartbeat. Determined to confirm her suspicions beyond the sensory clues she had already gathered, Lillian sought a tool to solidify her plan. She recalled her old friend Marta, who worked at a pharmacy in downtown Baton Rouge, a woman whose discretion Lillian had always trusted. Using the phone in the living room, its buttons worn from years of use, Lillian placed a call to Marta during one of Edward's long days at the auto shop. Her voice steady, she asked for something to deal with a pest problem, a vague request that Marta understood without prying. 2 days later, Marta arrived at the house, her footsteps light on the porch, the scent of her lavender hand cream a brief contrast to the oppressive weight of Lillian's thoughts. Marta handed over a small cardboard box, its edges slightly crushed, and described its contents as a colorless, tasteless powder meant for pests. Lillian's fingers closed around the box, feeling its lightweight promise of finality. She thanked Marta, her face composed, and tucked the box into her jewelry box in the living room, nestling it beside her tactile notebook, where her secrets were etched in raised dots. Lillian's vigilance over Edward intensified, her senses attuned to every shift in his behavior. She noticed how he had grown more cautious. His clothes no longer left carelessly on chairs but hung neatly in the closet, his showers now immediate upon his return, as if to erase any trace of his secret life. Yet one night, as the clock ticked past 11, Lillian lay awake, her ears catching a new sound from the porch. Edward's voice, low and hushed, drifted through the open window, his words muffled but deliberate, as if he feared being overheard. She strained to listen, her body still beneath the covers, and caught the word tomorrow, sharp and clear, followed by a faint feminine laugh from the phone, a sound that pierced her like a needle. The laugh was light, intimate, a confirmation of the other woman's existence, a sound that carried the weight of stolen moments. Edward's boots scuffed the porch as he ended the call, and Lillian heard the door creak as he re-entered the house, his steps heavy with the guilt he did not know she could sense. The laugh lingered in her mind, a final spark that ignited her decision. She would no longer tolerate the shadow of betrayal that hung over her home, the scent of another woman that clung to Edward's clothes, the secrets whispered in the night. The bourbon bottle, with its dusty surface and solitary purpose, became more than a part of Edward's routine. It was her weapon, a means to reclaim control in a world where she could not see, but could act. She sat in her armchair the next evening, her hands folded in her lap, listening as Edward poured his drink, the familiar clink of glass against the table echoing through the quiet house. The dust on the bottle, untouched by anyone but him, was a silent ally in her plan, a symbol of the predictability she would use against him. Lillian's heart remained steady, her resolve as unyielding as the cypress trees outside, their roots deep and immovable in the Louisiana earth. On the 9th day, Lillian Walker's resolve reached its breaking point, her decision to act forged in the crucible of Edward's betrayal and the silent evidence she had gathered in her darkened world. The Baton Rouge home, shrouded in the stillness of a late Louisiana evening, seemed to hold its breath as the cypress trees outside swayed under a restless breeze. Edward returned home later than usual, his footsteps heavier, uneven, as though weighed down by exhaustion or the haze of alcohol consumed elsewhere. The front door groaned as it opened, the familiar clatter of his keys hitting the table by the entrance echoing through the house, but the sound carried a sluggishness that Lillian noted with her sharpened senses. She sat in her armchair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her body still but her mind alert, attuned to every movement in the house. The air was thick with the scent of impending rain, but beneath it, she caught the faint trace of that floral perfume, now a constant shadow clinging to Edward's presence. Edward moved directly to the kitchen, his boots dragging slightly on the hardwood floor, a departure from his usual deliberate stride. Lillian listened as the refrigerator door opened with its familiar hiss, followed by the soft clink of the Jack Daniels bottle being lifted from the top shelf of the cabinet. She had prepared for this moment the previous night, when Edward was asleep and the house was silent. Under the cover of darkness, she had retrieved the small box of powder from her jewelry box, her fingers steady as she opened it and measured out a precise amount. She had climbed onto a stool, her movements careful to avoid any noise, and reached for the bourbon bottle, its dusty surface cool under her touch. With meticulous care, she had poured the colorless, tasteless powder into the bottle, shaking it gently to ensure it dissolved into the amber liquid. Afterwards, she had wiped the bottle clean with a damp cloth, erasing any trace of her interference, leaving no hint of the deadly alteration. The bottle returned to its place, stood as an unsuspecting accomplice in her plan, its dust resettled by morning to mask her actions. Now, as Edward poured his nightly drink, Lillian remained motionless, her ears tracking the familiar ritual. The gurgle of bourbon filled the heavy glass, the ice cubes clinking as they settled, a sound as rhythmic to her as a heartbeat. Edward moved to the living room, the leather of his recliner creaking as he sank into it, the television flickering on with its muted drone of a late-night talk show. Lillian's heart beat steadily, betraying none of the storm raging within her. She heard the glass touch the wooden coffee table, a sharp tap, followed by the soft sound of Edward's first sip. The moment stretched, each second a thread in the tapestry of her vengeance. She sat in her armchair, the worn fabric under her palms grounding her senses attuned to the subtle shifts in the room. The cicadas outside continued their relentless hum, but inside the house felt like a held breath, waiting for the inevitable. Minutes passed, marked only by the faint ticks of the clock on the mantel. Then a change came. Edward's breathing, usually steady and unobtrusive, grew labored, a heavy, uneven rasp that cut through the television's chatter. Lillian tilted her head, her ears straining to catch every detail. The sound grew more erratic, punctuated by a low, guttural cough, as if Edward were struggling to clear his throat. The glass slipped from his hand, tumbling to the floor with a dull thud, the shatter of glass muffled by the rug. Shards scattered, their faint tinkle a stark contrast to the sudden silence that followed. Edward's body slumped, a soft thump as it hit the floor, accompanied by a single, haggard wheeze that faded into nothingness. The house fell quiet, the television's drone now the only sound, its artificial cheer a mockery of the scene unfolding in the living room. Lillian rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate, guided by the sound of the fallen glass. Her bare feet navigated the familiar path across the hardwood, avoiding the furniture with the ease of long practice. She knelt beside Edward, her fingers reaching out to find his form sprawled on the rug. Her hands brushed over his face, the skin already cooling, the stubble rough against her fingertips. She pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse, but found only stillness, a void where life had been moments before. The absence of his heartbeat confirmed what she had planned, yet it brought neither triumph nor remorse, only a hollow emptiness that settled in her chest like a stone. She lingered there for a moment, her hands resting on his chest, the fabric of his shirt faintly scented with that floral perfume, now a fading echo of the betrayal that had driven her to this act. Lillian stood, her movements steady despite the weight of what she had done. She returned to her armchair, settling into its familiar contours, her hands folding once more in her lap. The television continued its mindless chatter, but she paid it no mind. The house was hers now, its silence a canvas for her thoughts. She sat through the night, the hours marked by the distant rumble of thunder as a storm approached, the air growing heavy with the promise of rain. The cicadas fell silent, and the world outside seemed to mirror the stillness within her. Lillian did not move, did not sleep, her senses attuned to the quiet that enveloped her, a quiet that belonged to her alone. The bourbon bottle, its contents now spent, stood on the kitchen shelf, its dust undisturbed, a silent witness to the final sip that had ended Edward's life and set Lillian free in a world she could not see but had reclaimed through her own unrelenting will. The morning after Edward Walker's death, the Baton Rouge home stood silent under the weight of a gray Louisiana sky, the cypress trees outside casting their long, mournful shadows across the porch. Lillian Walker sat in her armchair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her senses attuned to the emptiness that now filled the house. The storm that had threatened the previous night had passed, leaving behind a damp heaviness in the air and the faint scent of wet earth. At precisely 8 o'clock, Lillian reached for the phone on the oak table beside her, its buttons familiar under her fingertips. She dialed the police, her voice calm and measured as she reported finding her husband dead in the living room, suggesting he had perhaps drunk too much bourbon, that something had gone wrong. She hung up and waited, her body still, her face betraying no trace of the act she had committed, the powder she had slipped into his bottle now a secret locked within her. Detective Paul Marshall arrived within the hour, his heavy footsteps echoing on the porch as he entered the house, accompanied by 2 officers whose boots scuffed the hardwood floor. Lillian remained in her armchair, her head tilted slightly as she listened to their movements. Marshall's presence filled the room, his cologne sharp with notes of pine, a contrast to the lingering trace of bourbon that clung to the air. He examined Edward's body, still sprawled on the living room rug, the shattered glass nearby glinting in the morning light. Lillian sensed his gaze on her, heavy and scrutinizing, noting the composure that seemed unnatural for a grieving widow. Her slight frame, her sightless eyes, and the quiet dignity of her posture disarmed him, however, softening his suspicion into something closer to pity. He asked routine questions, his voice low, but Lillian answered with a steadiness that left no room for doubt, her words painting a picture of a tragic accident, a husband who had perhaps mixed alcohol with medication. Marshall inspected the bourbon bottle on the kitchen shelf, its dusty surface undisturbed, and bagged it for analysis, unaware that the rare poison Lillian had used was beyond the reach of standard tests. The investigation moved swiftly, its brevity a testament to the lack of evidence pointing to foul play. The coroner's report confirmed poisoning, but the absence of identifiable toxins led to speculation that Edward had ingested something inadvertently, perhaps a prescription drug mixed with his bourbon. The case was closed within days, classified as an accidental overdose, and Edward's death faded into the background of Baton Rouge's daily rhythm. Lillian remained in the house, alone now, the silence of her world no longer punctuated by Edward's footsteps or the clink of his glass. She sat by the window each morning, feeling the sun's warmth on her skin, but the light brought no comfort, only a stark reminder of the emptiness that had settled within her. The cicadas outside resumed their endless song, their hum a constant backdrop to her solitude. But the house felt larger, its spaces more cavernous without Edward's presence. In the days that followed, Lillian returned to her jewelry box in the living room, her fingers tracing the familiar contours of the oak until they found her tactile notebook. She opened it, The pages soft under her touch and continued her meticulous recordings, etching the events of that fateful night in raised dots. She described the sound of the glass shattering, the labored rasp of Edward's final breaths, the coldness of his skin under her fingers. She did not know why she felt compelled to document these details, perhaps to preserve the truth for herself, a confession she could never speak aloud, or perhaps to leave a trace for someone else to find. A distant possibility that the world might one day know what she had done. Each mark of the stylus was deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of her actions, a way to anchor the chaos of her emotions in the order of her private code. On quiet afternoons, Lillian retrieved Edward's shirt from the closet, the one she had first found with traces of the other woman's perfume. She held it to her face, inhaling the faint, fading scent of vanilla and flowers, now mingled with the musty odor of fabric left untouched. The perfume was a relic of the betrayal that had driven her to act, a reminder of the life Edward had lived beyond her reach. She sat with the shirt in her lap, her fingers tracing its seams, the collar where lipstick had once lingered, and felt neither guilt nor triumph. Her vengeance had been precise, executed with the same clarity that guided her through her sightless world, but it had not brought the liberation she might have expected. Instead, it left her adrift, surrounded by the silence of a home that no longer felt like hers, its rooms filled with the ghosts of a marriage that had crumbled long before Edward's final sip. Lillian closed the jewelry box, sealing her notebook and secrets within, and returned to her armchair. The cypress trees outside swayed in the breeze, their shadows moving across the porch like silent companions. She sat there day after day, listening to the world beyond her window, the distant hum of cars, the chatter of birds, the rustle of leaves. The silence of the house had become her new vision, a canvas where she painted her thoughts, her memories, her solitude. Lillian Walker, blind but unyielding, had reclaimed her life through an act of retribution, but the cost was a world where the warmth of the sun felt cold, and the only truth left was the ashes of what had been.